Today, we're going to turn cream into butter. Now, if you've done any research online, you'll find that there's a lot of debate as to the best way to make butter. We've used a lot of them here at Redgate Farm over the years. Different temperatures, different methods. The point is, you've got to agitate it. And it really doesn't matter how you do that. Each method has its pros and cons, and based on experimenting, you can get an idea what works best for you. But today I'm going to show you the 3 most common ways we do it here at our farm. And frankly, the only reason we choose these methods is because it's just what works best for our lifestyle and the items and resources that we have available. So let's get started. So the first method for making butter I'm going to show you is just the age-old shake the jar method. Remember, the idea here is that we agitate the cream. It doesn't really matter how you agitate it, and there's actually stories of people tying it to the back of their horse-drawn plow or other equipment for the garden and letting the horses just bounce it around as they work through the day so they have butter at the end. But we use kids around here. We've got a few to spare. Come here, buddy. Start shaking. Now I'm going to let him just go get comfortable. We're going to start the timer, and we'll come back in a bit after the butter turns and explain the process. Meanwhile, I'll start preparing all the other ways we're going to show you today. All right, now we're back for the second method. That is the blender. Now, I personally use a Vitamix. We use it around our house for all kinds of things, and it has the power that we need. But a few other items you need when making butter is your method of agitation, be it the jar we already saw, the mixer, the blender. You're going to need a strainer to strain out the buttermilk, and obviously a container to put the buttermilk into. And then you're going to need a bowl for collecting your butter in. Now, if you're just doing one batch, one jar, then you're not going to need a whole lot of storage space here. But we're actually going to be making a lot today, even after this video. So I'm starting with larger bowls that we can just combine it all into one. But let's get started here with the mixer method. So I'm going to give my jar a little shake. That's just to get the cream off the edge of the jar there. Sometimes it sort of really creams up on top. Now, whatever container you use, you want to make sure you don't fill it more than halfway. And that's because it will really froth up. So I actually am going to have a little bit left there. And you'll see how it froths up here. All right. I'm going to turn it on. Turn it up a bit. But not too much. We don't need to over agitate it. And then we just wait. So we're back here with the mixer. It's not quite done yet, but once the whipped cream starts, sometimes you'll get a little air pocket in the bottom of the mixer. It's an easy fix. You just turn it off, kind of let that air bubble release, and start it up again. You may have to do that 2 or 3 times through this phase, but it's really not a big deal. So I've just turned this off for a moment so you can hear me. But we've got air pockets still going on. I've gotten them out a couple of times, and I could keep doing that. But sometimes a blender may not be really agreeable to sticking a spatula in if you're not sure how far down to go. So another little trick you can use is put in a small piece of ice. You want it big enough that it'll last a few minutes, but small enough it's not going to put too much water into your milk. By dropping that in, I've actually created a way to continue agitating. That little bit of a difference can help. All right, at this stage, we've gone from the whipped cream back to a liquid, and now the solids are actually separating out right now. That's why it's starting to change sound. It's gumming up a little bit because the butter, in this case, is collecting down around the blade. So I'll continue turning it down because I don't want to overbeat it, but I want it to continue working for just a moment. Okay, we're back now. It's been about 6 minutes total, and we've got buttermilk and butter. So the next stage is to separate it out. And you'll see the buttermilk pours right through there, and the butter solids will collect right in the stream. And there you have it. All right, so now that we've got our solids, I'm actually going to put them into the other bowl. I don't worry too much about getting everything all clean at this point because I'm going to use it again. But as you can see here, we have buttermilk, and this is a perfectly drinkable milk. In fact, it's quite good and refreshing. And then we've got the solid butter that you'll see how I rinse and such later. Now, it's on to the mixer. All right. Well, we're back here for the third method, and that is using a mixer. Now, I actually used a handheld mixer early on in our marriage, and it worked just fine as well. Again, agitation is the key. But now I've got a bit of a nicer KitchenAid mixer, so we're going to do this almost the same process. I have the whisk attachment on it. And in my case, the bowl is large enough I can easily do a full quart of cream. Boy, that's got some nice thick chunks in it. We make cream for a couple days and then and let it sit, so we wind up collecting several jars, and I make large batches all at once. So slightly older cream tends to really cream up and get chunky on the top. Okay, we're going to get this going. I'm going to put my cover on just to try to prevent some splashing. And in this case, I turn it up pretty high. Another reason you don't want to get it too full, it'll splash everywhere. If you look closely here, you can see the cream is starting to fluff up a bit. It is turning into whipped cream. That's the first stage. Then it becomes a very thick whipped version before it separates. Here you can see we've reached the whipped cream stage. It's very stiff whipped cream. It will kind of peak up if I touch it. Alright, and you can see it just turned. You can see how everything turned to liquid. And we've got solids kind of watching the sides of the bowl there. I usually let it go for another 15 seconds or so, just to make sure it finishes. And there you have it. Butter and buttermilk. Now we'll strain this too. All right, it's been a few more minutes. And you can see on top here we have a good separation of the butter and the buttermilk. So we're going to strain out that buttermilk and start the next process here soon. All right, now that we've used the three methods, I wanted to show you a quick side-by-side comparison. I know the bowls can make things look a little deceiving, but this small bowl here was the jar shake method, and this butter came from about half a jar of cream, or about 2 cups. This bowl here was the second method, using the blender,
And that came from about 7/8 of a jar of cream. I didn't put quite the whole jar in, but you can see it's just about the same amount. And then this bowl here is from the mixer, and it's about the same amount as well. So over the years, we've done this experiment a couple of times, and for sure there are differences and advantages. For one, we never fail to get the most butter from the jar shaking method. I can only theorize that it has to do with the slower agitation process. Perhaps it realigns those particles a little differently. I honestly don't know. The buttermilk is also a little bit thinner. The blender method is definitely the fastest and most convenient, so probably our preferred method, even though we lose some of the actual butter in the end result there. And then aside to that would be the mixer, which is also a nice way to go if you don't have a good blender. There's certainly nothing wrong with doing it. It just takes a bit longer than the blender method, but not nearly as long as the jar shake method.
Okay, we finished making the butter, but now we have to process the butter. Now the next step is to rinse. And the reason is, you can see how as the butter sat here, it actually drained out additional buttermilk. Now, I did quite a bit more off camera, so that's why there's such a pile of butter here. I like to process it all at once. But as each batch sat there while I made the next batch, the buttermilk continued to drain out. The problem with this is once you put it in your fridge, the buttermilk is actually what goes sour faster. So we want to rinse as much of that buttermilk out as we can. It also helps to thicken up the butter a bit so it's more sliceable if that's what you want. So what we're going to do, I prefer it cold. It's easier to work with. So I just put a few cubes of ice in and fill it with water just to cover the butter. And then I'll take my spatula and start pressing the butter around. This is called working the butter. Whoops, made a mess. This will cause all the different batches to start to mix together. It'll all take on the same flavor, but most importantly, it's washing the buttermilk out of the butter. And you can kind of see here how almost creamy colored that water has become already. So after I work it for a bit, then we'll strain it again. I personally don't get too picky about how much I dump out. This is just the early phases. So we'll add a little bit more ice. I want to keep that butter nice and cool. Okay, round 2. Now you can see progress already here. You see that water is staying a bit clearer. It doesn't have the creamy color it had in the first batch, the first rinse. Okay, this is the third rinse. Typically, it takes 3 rinses to get this process done. Every now and then, it might be 4 or 5 if I have a big enough batch, but generally I do 3 and call it quits there. Okay, now we're going to check to see how clear this water is. If you look closely, it's actually pretty clear. So I think we can call that good. I'm not sure if you can tell with the lighting I have in this kitchen, but it's actually relatively clear. So the next step, now that we've rinsed the butter, is to drain the butter. That's probably the most difficult part of the whole process. I've found the easiest way is to use a nice big bowl and just really press it up against the sides. I've got a few ice cubes left here. I'm going to just get rid of those. I'm going to press that butter up against the sides, kind of leave a hole down in the center. And you can see that water squeezing out. And again, I'm going to do this process 3 to 4 times typically, sometimes more, until I get down to just a few random drips, if anything. The more you squeeze, the firmer your butter will be. So I guess in that sense, you can see I poured off all that. Now I'm going to scrape it and start over. But in that sense, if you're looking for a creamier, smoother butter, then you could do just 1 or 2 of these kind of squeezes to get the remaining liquid out, and it'll just be smoother and runnier. But in my case, I like it thicker. All right, I have done 4 good rounds of pressing this butter. And as you can see, when I run my spatula around now, there's really nothing that collects at the bottom, just a few little drops. And that's pretty much what we're looking for. They're nice clear, fairly clear. And for our purposes here at home, I'm perfectly happy with that. If you wanted to continue working it for perfectly clear, rinse it again, work it some more, get it drier, that's really a personal preference. But this is what we've got. And at this point, you can choose whether to salt it. You could leave it unsalted. You could put it in a dish in the fridge or bundle it up into a mold, and once it's molded into a shape, you can actually wrap it and freeze it. So we found it freezes pretty well for probably 6 months or so at least. Usually we eat it by then, so I don't know exactly how long. But this is beautiful butter. It's a very rewarding feeling to know you've made your own. And I do want to point out, for anyone who happens to notice, this butter is fairly white. It's a very light color, and that's because it's from our goats. Goats tend to process the beta-carotene a lot more efficiently than cows, and therefore we don't get that yellow coloring in the butter nearly as boldly, I guess you could say. It's a much whiter butter. I've also found the way I process it, you can see this is pretty creamy here. It doesn't sit out on the counter as well as a store-bought butter would, but that's just part of how I process it. So we keep it in the fridge, and then it's nice and spreadable whenever we want to use it. So there you have it, homemade butter.